Well, I'd like to begin our program by telling you a little bit about the organization that is sponsoring this speech tonight. The motto of the John Birch Society is less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. Frankly, we think that says it all. We want a better world for ourselves, our children, and our children's children. Now, what will it take to build a better world? Well, it certainly will take God's help. It will also take more responsibility on the part of all of us to preserve and protect our heritage of freedom. And finally, it will mean defeating present and would-be tyrants who have always constituted the greatest threat to freedom and happiness. Today, the John Birch Society is recognized by friend and foe alike as being the largest, most effective freedom organization in the United States. Our program has been summarized by Robert Welsh, the founder of the John Birch Society, in these words: education is our total strategy, truth is our only weapon. As part of our educational program to make Americans aware of the threats that this nation faces, we are sponsoring this meeting this evening. We think you will agree, and after hearing our speaker, that the information presented is of paramount importance. But we also believe that responsible action must go hand in hand with education. We hope this meeting will motivate many of you to learn more about the John Birch Society. For when you do, we are sure you will want to become part of this educational army. We think the John Birch Society is the finest body of concerned citizens anywhere, and we, of course, appreciate your presence at this meeting. And before I forget to mention this, if you do have any questions for Mr. McManus, if you would please wait till after we finally have concluded the formal part of the meeting, and Mr. McManus will stick around and chat with you, answer any questions you may have. And now on to this evening's speaker. By way of background, John F. McManus was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. He received a Bachelor of Science degree in physics from Holy Cross College in 1957, and then served 3 years as an officer in the Marine Corps. In 1960, he began a career as an electronics engineer. In 1966, Mr. McManus left the engineering profession and accepted a full-time position with the John Birch Society. He has served in a variety of posts and has been the Society's chief spokesman since 1973. In June of 1991, Mr. McManus was named president of the John Birch Society. And about a year ago, he was promoted again to the position of President Emeritus of the John Birch Society. In addition to being the former publisher of the New American Magazine, Mr. McManus is also the author of 4 books: The Insiders, Financial Terrorism, Changing Commands, and William F. Buckley Jr., Pied Piper for the Establishment. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in extending a very warm welcome to the President Emeritus of the John Birch Society, Mr. John F. McManus.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here. Tom, I got a job for you. I should have gotten a glass of water. Somebody get me a sip of water. I appreciate that. So we're here tonight to talk about the United Nations, but I'm notorious for starting off this talk with an attempt at humor. So let's give it a try, right? I can tell a story about the burglars who are ransacking a home, and here we go. Thank you very much. Well, the burglars are doing what burglars do. They're stealing everything they could find, shoving it in the bags. And all of a sudden they heard a voice saying, "The Lord is with you." Well, that shook them up a little bit. So nothing happened. So one burglar said to the other, he says, "Come on, keep going. Look, we got more stuff to collect here." So they keep collecting. And again the voice says, "The Lord is with you." So one of them got out a flashlight and he's shining it around the room, and he sees over at the corner of the room there's a big bird cage and a parrot. And he says to his buddy, he says, "Oh, it's just a silly parrot, you got nothing to worry about." And he shines the light a little bit lower, and down at the bottom of the bird cage there's a great big Doberman pinscher. And the parrot says, "Sick 'em, Lord." You're very kind. Thank you. So we're going to talk about the United Nations Exposed, how the U.S. entered and why we should withdraw. All right. Now, start off with commonly held attitudes about the United Nations. There are people who say, well, it never accomplished anything. It's just a forum for blowing up steam. They use the word bloviate. I love that word. Right? It needs to be reformed. They must get better leaders. But they feed hungry children. They don't tell you that the money goes to the government, and the government uses most of it to build its own influence. And then they say it's a place to talk rather than fight. Right? Now, you all heard those arguments. So let's go over them here. The most oft-repeated one is that the UN is a place to talk rather than fight. Well, let's suppose that there are two nations and they have a fight between each other, a good squabble going on. It might end up being shooting a squabble or of some kind. So rather than have them work it out between them, one to the other, they take it to the United Nations, and now you have 193 nations involved. That's brilliance, right? That's brilliance. So the UN is a place to talk rather than fight? No. That argument doesn't hold up at all, right? Why involve 193 UN member nations when a problem affects only a few? And as far as our own country is concerned, don't we have an ambassador in practically all of those 193 nations? And if we have a squabble with that nation, then let's have our ambassadors sit down with the leaders of their country and see if they can't work it out. Don't give it to the United Nations and involve the world, right? So these arguments don't hold up, right? The second most oft-repeated attitude is the UN never accomplishes anything, right? But the UN actually employs tens of thousands of people all around the world. And they're not doing nothing. Right? Are we to believe that all these UN workers are doing nothing? Right? Here's the United Nations headquarters in New York City. It was built on land donated by the Rockefellers, which is no surprise, really. That's a pretty large building. It is full of people doing nothing. Right? I'm glad you're catching on. Here's the International Monetary Fund down in Washington. Good-sized building, full of people doing something, right? Here's the International Labor Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, right? That's a good-sized building as well. Here's another one, the World Health Organization in Geneva, right? Full of people doing nothing, right? Just remember, they're doing nothing. Here's the International Criminal Court in The Hague. The International Criminal Court is now saying that they're going to start prosecuting Americans. The United States has never joined the International Criminal Court. We had a program in the Birch Society that we believe stopped the U.S. from doing that. And it's one of the feathers in our cap, as we say. But there again is another good-sized building of people doing nothing, right? Here's the World Bank down in Washington. We're back in Washington, right? So the point that I'm making is that these people do something, right? Now there are other large offices that I don't have pictures of the buildings, but the Food and Agriculture Building in Rome, and the Seabed Authority in Jamaica, and the Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, and the Maritime Organization in London, plus more agencies and UN organizations in Tokyo, Bangkok, Montreal, Paris, Nairobi, and so on. Full of people working for the United Nations, and ladies and gentlemen, they're not doing nothing. Right? Now, I had the privilege of giving this talk to a brand new Birch Society chapter and organization, a nice crowd of people in the central of Connecticut, in the middle of Connecticut. And there was a man in the group who came and he said, I was skeptical about what I was going to hear, but he said, I have to confess to you that I'm one of the people who always said that the UN never accomplished a thing. I'm not going to say that anymore. Right? That made me feel good, right? But that was a very good meeting. We got new members and we got some activity going there in a place where we never had anything before. All right, now let's go back to the beginning of our country and then the beginning of the UN and show what you'd have to say is a fundamental difference, right? A very important difference. Our country started with the Declaration of Independence, and it says what I like to refer to as the thunderous assertion. A thunderous assertion. Men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And in the very next breath, they define the role of government. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So everything's in its proper order. God's on top. Individuals with rights given by God are next. And down at the bottom is government, whose purpose is to merely protect those rights. Not to redistribute the wealth, not to take control of people's lives, and so forth. That's Americanism in a very short definition. Right? Then we came along with the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is fairly explicit, especially the first of the 10 in the Bill of Rights. It says, Congress shall not, right? And I always love to say up to the 10th Amendment that says if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. Right? So Congress shall make no law respecting God-given rights. Right? All right, there you have a definition of America. Right? What about the United Nations? Well, they came out with a Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, written by Eleanor Roosevelt, by the way. And it says in it, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law. What they did in this document is go over all of the rights that we have in the Declaration, in our First Amendment, and the Bill of Rights, and others besides. And they talk about having human beings have this right, this one, this one, this one, but then they qualify it all toward the end. And they say everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law. So the UN takes to itself the power to declare a law that cancels the right. Can you do that legitimately in our country? No. Congress shall make no law. Right? Well, that was 1948. 1966, the UN came out with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Same thing. Rights may be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law and are necessary. Again, by law, they can cancel the right. Now, I had somebody else come up to me recently when I gave this talk, and he said, I would have quit right then and there. You don't need to go any further to convince me. Well, let's go a little further. Right? Here's the Constitution of the Soviet Union. What does it say? It's the same as the United Nations, but they have no God. They say rights come from government, and they say they can cancel at will by law. Right? The Soviet Union and the United Nations are the same. The Soviet Union's gone, now we've got to make it same and get rid of the United Nations. Right? So we see we got polar opposites here. On the left, you've got the United States with God, that rights come from God and no law can cancel. And on the other side, you've got the United Nations, no God, rights come from government and canceled by law, right? Now, here's a book called Philip Drew Administrator, and I put this right up front because it is so important. The man pictured there is the author of the book. His name is Edward Mandell House, and I consider him the arch conspirator of the 20th century. He befriended Woodrow Wilson. He convinced Woodrow Wilson that he was the most brilliant man that ever lived. And Wilson used to talk about him and say, he's my alter ego, he's my other self. Right? I've never met a man who I agreed with so much and so forth. So what did Edward Mandell House say in his book, Philip Drew Administrator? Well, he said he was working for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. He had a dedicatory quote in the book from Giuseppe Mazzini, who was the successor of Adam Weishaupt and the creator of the Carbonari movement in Italy, a vile creature who is one of the more important conspirators of the last several hundred years. But here's House quoting Mazzini. He was the advisor of Presidents Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt. The book came out in 1913. President Roosevelt's mother gave young Franklin a copy of the book in 1920. Right? In the book, House said he's working for socialism as dreamed up by Karl Marx. What else do you need to know about the man? Right? He despised the U.S. Constitution. He advocated the income tax and Federal Reserve, both of which we got during the Wilson administration. He proposed world government, and when the United States Senate said no to the League of Nations in 1919, he launched the Council on Foreign Relations. We'll talk more about that down the road. So keep in mind Edward Mandell House, very important. Get to know a little bit about him, and you'll be as revulsed as I am every time I think of him. In 1919, the U.S. Senate, at the end of World War I, was asked to approve entry of the United States into the League of Nations. So they debated the matter for 9 months, and they said no. 9 months they debated it, and they said no. Keep 9 months in mind, we'll come back to that. Right? So what is this Council on Foreign Relations that we've mentioned here? We have a book called The Shadows of Power, and it's about who is in the Council on Foreign Relations, why, and what to do about it, and what the Council on Foreign Relations is all about. It is the premier world government promoting organization in our country. And it's very powerful and somewhat frightening, right? So let's move ahead now a little bit in history. We go to December 7th of 1941. I think you know what happened then, right? The Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, right? Within 30 days, a group of diplomats, I guess we could call them, they met and they issued a formal declaration of the United Nations. 30 days after Pearl Harbor, a declaration of the United Nations. Right? And that was the first time the term had been used. There were people who wanted a world government. They didn't call it anything, but finally they now started calling it the United Nations. In 1943, the United States, the United Kingdom, USSR, and China agreed to form a world government. In 1944, at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, Dumbarton Oaks is a big estate in Washington, and a lot of meetings are held there. That conference created the initial draft of the UN Charter. And in 1945, the San Francisco Conference, 50 nations sent delegates, and they produced the final UN Charter. Now, these years, of course, 42, 3, 4, and 5, were years when Americans were worried about the war. They didn't realize what was going on behind the scenes, that people were going to build a world government, and we were going to lose our sovereignty, we were going to lose the U.S. as we know it and love it, and so on. So, who were some of those people? Practically all of them were members of this Council on Foreign Relations that we've already talked about. So they started, and the war ended in Europe on May 6th of 1945. They called it VE Day. And then Japan surrendered finally on August 14th of 1945. And that was called VJ Day. And I hate to have to admit it, but I'm old enough to remember those days. So the founding of the United Nations actually occurred from May until July, a 2 full month period. And the US delegation at the founding meeting held in San Francisco, there were 16 secret communists in the US delegation. And there were 43 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. One of the chief individuals was a man named Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was later found out to have been a secret communist. He went to prison for lying about that. He didn't go to prison for treason. The statute of limitations had run out. But he went to prison for lying about the fact that he was a member of the Communist Party. I have a little vignette to tell you about. I have a son who went to the University of New Hampshire, and one night he called home, and his mother answered the phone, and so he said, "I got to talk to Dad," so I put Dad on the phone, and my son said, "Are you sitting?" I said, "What did you do now?" No. They went, "No," he said, "I didn't do anything." "No, that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling to tell you who's going to come to the campus to speak." I said, "Okay, who?" He said, "Alger Hiss." I said, "You got to be kidding." No, he's coming. So I got together a lot of birches. We had 2 full carloads of birches, and we drove. I live near Boston, by the way, so we loaded 2 cars full of birches. And I had just written one of my birch log columns about his, and the fact that he was a no-good, rotten communist, right? So we took 500 copies of that, and I told my guys, I said, just go down the aisle and give them some and pass one, take one, pass it in, take one. Everybody in the place got a copy of my thing before the program started, right? So they all had a perspective on his before it started. And then his came out, and he gave his usual, there were liars who were lying about me and this and that, and, you know, it was just despicable. But then after the program was over, he submitted the questions. And he looked around the audience and he saw a guy over there he had on jeans, he had on a lumber shirt, he had a beard, he looked kind of like a good left-winger and so forth. It was one of our birchers. So he asked him, "What's your question?" And the guy got up and he gave a nice little entry, and he ended up saying, "How come you never told us about Elizabeth Bentley and some of the other ex-communists who identified you as a communist?" And you can't deny what they were saying. Well, he wasn't happy about that, but anyhow. So we had some fun, and then about 10 days later, I got a call at the Birch headquarters from some members on Long Island in New York. And they said, "Alger Hiss is coming to speak at local college. What do we do?" I told them what we did in New Hampshire, and they did the same thing down in Long Island. And Hiss went to the press and he says, "Everywhere I go now, the John Birch Society is chasing me." So we sometimes say if you're birching and you're not having fun, you're not doing it right. It can be a lot of fun, right? It certainly is rewarding. But there's Alger Hiss, one of the key individuals. Chief authors of the UN Charter were Andrei Vyshinsky of the Soviet Union, an open communist, and Alger Hiss of the United States, a secret communist. All right, so we better take a look at the charter. Right? What happened is the charter was brought back to Washington and given to the U.S. Senate to vote on whether or not to accept it. So remember that the League of Nations was defeated after the Senate debated the matter for 9 months. But they debated the United Nations for 6 days, and they approved the UN Charter by a vote of 89 to 2. Only 2 senators said no. Now, you all heard of the two, I'm sure. You've heard of Henrik Shipstead of Minnesota and William Langer of North Dakota, haven't you? No, no, no. Nobody's ever heard of them except people who have heard us speak about those two. We're going to try and build a monument to those two men someday, right? They got monuments going up all over Washington. There ought to be one for these two, all right? Shipstead and Langer, their speeches are in the congressional record. I dug them out. I pulled a sentence out of each. Shipstead said control of the war powers must remain in Congress. He saw that it would not because of the charter. Langer said the UN would have the authority to send our boys all over the earth. And indeed, they have done exactly that. Right? There was a diplomat named J. Reuben Clark who was instrumental in persuading some senators in 1919 to say no to the League of Nations, and he was still at it in 1945, telling them not to go for the UN Charter. And he said that the UN Charter is a war document, not a peace document. It makes it practically certain that we shall have future wars. It removes the power to declare war, choose which side to be on, determine the equipment to use, and command our sons who do the fighting, right? Yeah. He was right on every point, right? So let's look at the Charter. Here we see the first page of the United Nations Charter. It, incidentally, is no bigger than the Constitution of the United States. It's about the same size, right? Article 1, they use the word peace 6 times, and therefore they insist that the United Nations is a peace organization. But in Article 2, they authorize war. So how can a peace organization be authorizing war? Well, that's the United Nations. Article 2 discusses the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7 in the Charter. And Chapter 7 authorizes demonstrations, blockade, and other operations by air, sea, or land forces of the United Nations. That's war. All of that is war, right? Now let's suppose you're a United States Senator and you're asked to vote on whether or not we should go ahead and join the United Nations. You read the Charter and you get to Article 25, right, which says the members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. If you're a United States Senator, would you sign that? Does that not trump the Constitution? Right. 89 senators did. Right. Now why? There were some good people among those 89. Even Robert Taft of Ohio. He was one of the ones who said that. He later regretted it, publicly stated his regret. See, I can remember that period. I am that old. And I can remember my own dad, who was a patriotic American. And he was saying, you know, we had World War I, we had World War II, we don't want to have another war, let's try it. Let's give something else a try. And that's the way it was sold. It was sold to my dad, it was sold to the senators, it was sold to the clergymen from the pulpits, and so on and so on. So the United Nations was going to stop war. And there have been more wars since the United Nations started than at any other time in the history of mankind. But that's what happened. 89-2. Article 43 of the Charter says all members of the United Nations undertake to make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, and facilities, including the rites of passage necessary for the purpose of maintaining peace and security. Right? These are things that if you read this in 1945 and you were a good solid American like Shipstead and Langer, you would have said, no thanks, no thanks. Here's Colin Powell, a disgraceful individual. He became the Secretary of State in the early days of George W. Bush's administration. He didn't last very long. I think they found out how dumb he is. He said, with respect to U.S. policy, when it comes to our role as a member of the Security Council, we obviously are bound by UN resolutions. Right? should have been fired on the spot. His Daddy Bush, Papa Bush. It is the sacred principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter to which the American people will henceforth pledge their allegiance. Sacred principles. Isn't that a little bit over the top? A little bit, yeah, just a little bit. Right? He's the father of the New World Order phrase, right? Over and over again. Now, something else happened in 1941 that's very little known. Right? The U.S. Congress was asked to pass the United Nations Participation Act. And they did so on December 20th of 1945. The United Nations Participation Act says in one part of it, the President shall not be deemed to require the authorization of Congress to send troops to enforce Security Council resolutions. That pushes the U.S. Constitution very much to the side, maybe even into the bottom drawer. Right? So what happened with that? Well, here's a valiant woman congressperson from Illinois. Jessie Sumner was a lawyer, and she opposed this. She said this measure gives congressional authority for surrendering the American people to an all-powerful world super government. Right on. Right. Over in Ohio, there was a senator who was an MD named Frederick Smith. And he said this measure strikes at the very heart of the Constitution. It provides that the power to declare war should be taken from the Congress and given to the President. Here is the essence of dictatorship. He was right, too. You know, we haven't declared war. Congress hasn't declared war since December 8, 1941. And what else is true is we haven't won a war since. Right? We'll get into that a little bit more as we proceed. So they took a vote in the House of Representatives, and the House approved the United Nations Participation Act 344 to 15. Only 15 said no. And the Senate approved by voice vote. So when you get a look at the measure that we propose a measure to get us out of the United Nations. It's in the House of Representatives. It's been introduced lately by Congressman Mike Rogers of Alabama. Previously, it was for years introduced by Ron Paul from Texas. Right? So you will see that the first item on that bill to get us out of the United Nations is to declare the United Nations Participation Act null. First item. I got to divert here and tell a story too. Ron Paul was a member of the House of Representatives for 10 or 12 years, and he tried to become a senator, and he missed out. So he went back to doctoring. And then again, he decided he had to get back into Congress, so he ran again. And this time he was put up against all of the Republican establishment types. President Bush, Newt Gingrich, some prominent people in Washington. 50 of them signed 50 congressmen signed a thing for his opponent in the primary. Right? But he won the primary, and then he won re-election, and so forth. And the day after he got re-elected, I got a phone call from a young Birch gal that I knew from summer camp. She had been at the Birch summer camps. And she said she wanted to go to work for Ron Paul. Could I help her? I said, well, are you willing to relocate to Washington? She said, yes. I said, okay, let me see what I can do. I had Ron Paul's home phone number. I called him. I congratulated him for his victory. He volunteered without me asking. He said, if it hadn't been for the Birchers helping me, I never would have made it. Right? Birch Society never accomplished anything. You've heard that. Right? Not so. Not so. So he eventually hired the girl. And she worked for him for 8 years, and now she's back at home down in the South. She had enough of Washington, right? So I asked her not too long ago when I saw her, I said, what did you do all those 8 years? And she said, well, I did the usual clerical type of thing. I answered the phone, I wrote letters, I And he took people on tours of different parts of the Capitol building and the House Office building and so on and so on. She said, but I did write one piece of legislation. I said, you did? One piece of legislation? Which one? She said, the United Nations Get Us Out bill. I said, you wrote that? How did you do that? She said, well, I called in the name of Ron Paul's office over to the Library of Congress, and I asked them, send me every bill that has ever been introduced to get us out of the United Nations. We're going to do some research on them. So she got a stack about this high. She read through all of them, and she picked out this, and she picked out that, and she picked out that, and she wrote the bill. And she presented it to Congressman Ron Paul and asked if he would consider introducing this on the floor of the House of Representatives. So he said, I'll look it over. Later in that same day, he came to her and he said, very good. He said, I changed one word. One word, what'd you change? He said, well, you said get out immediately, and I said give him 2 years. A member of the John Birch Society wrote the bill.
Wow.
Several congressmen after Ron Paul have introduced the bill, the same bill. It hadn't been changed. They didn't change a word. But the Birch Society never accomplished a thing. So the United Nations Participation Act is the first item on that bill. Cancel it. Here's Robert Taft from Ohio, one of my dad's favorites. The UN has become a trap. Let's go it alone. He regretted ever having voted for the entry into the United Nations. Now, the UN Charter, in Articles 52, 3, and 4, talks about regional arrangements. And that's NATO. And it's CETO. NATO is still existent. CETO went out of business after the Vietnam War, but our entry into the Vietnam was because of CETO, right? And the Charter says Security Council shall utilize such regional arrangements for enforcement action under its authority. Under its authority, right? Security Council shall be kept fully informed of activities. In other words, our military has to tell the UN what they're going to do before they do it. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, at the time, 1949, when it was being debated, he said NATO is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations. No doubt about it, right? So it was created in 1949. It derives its authority to exist from the UN Charter. Only 13 senators, led by Taft, said no. NATO now has 28 members and is in charge of the Afghanistan war. We are approaching the 17th anniversary of going into Afghanistan under the United Nations. Right? It's the longest war in America's history. Right? Are we going to win the war? No. They don't allow us to win. They milk it and milk it and milk it and grow power in the meantime and destroy the morale of our military and our people. It's just all so terrible, right? Now, the Korean War started in June of 1950, when North Korea's communist forces invaded South Korea, anti-communist. The UN Security Council said all members send forces. The US supplied the bulk of the troops and the bulk of the material for the war. There was no declaration of war. It's the first time our forces went into war without a declaration by Congress. So they went, some decent reporters went to President Truman, and they said, how can you do this? And he said, it's not a war, it's a police action. He said, if I can send troops to NATO, which he had done, I can send troops to Korea, which he was now about to do. The Korean War, at the beginning of it, UN flags were flying over our forces. until some of the troops got a little bit grumbling about it, and General MacArthur finally told them, take the flags down. The state of war in Korea continues to exist. It has never been settled. We still have 40,000 troops in South Korea in the United Nations Command for South Korea. And they are all subject to the orders of the United Nations. But how many Americans know that? Right? Korean War police action. At the end of 3 years of shooting, they finally had a semi-armistice. The armistice still exists. There's never been an end to the Korean War. It could break out again tomorrow. Right? General George Stratemeyer was one of our generals, Army general. You get into war to win it. You do not get into war to stand still and lose it, and we were required to lose it. We were not permitted to win. Right? Absolutely true. General Douglas MacArthur. He wanted to win so badly, they finally replaced him. They brought him back to the United States. Big ticker tape parades all over the country. In his own book, Reminiscences, General MacArthur quoted the Chinese general whose forces had come in to North Korea and opposed ours 20-1. Right? And General Lin Piao, the Chinese communist general, said, I would never have made the attack and risked my men and military reputation if I had not been assured that Washington would restrain General MacArthur. Was General MacArthur restrained? Yeah. He let it be known they didn't like that, so Truman fired him. Truman replaced him. And the war in Korea has never been stopped. And we went to the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, that's SEATO, a carbon copy of NATO. Created in 1954 by John Foster Dulles. John Foster Dulles and his brother Alan Dulles were House aides. They were with House when he formed the Council on Foreign Relations way back in 1919, 2021. SEATO, S-E-A-T-O, cited as authorization to place U.S. troops in Vietnam. So we got a duplicate going on here, right? Finally, President Lyndon Johnson came out in 1967 and he said, we are in Vietnam because the United States and our allies are committed by the SEATO Treaty to act to meet the common danger or aggression in Southeast Asia. So, are we meeting the aggression? Well, have the war rules of engagement from the Vietnam War. These were the rules that dictated how our men should fight the fight, how our pilots should fight, how our ground troops should fight, and so forth. And Barry Goldwater finally pried them out of the State Department, and he put them in the Congressional Record in 1985. I went and got copies of them. It made me sick, right? The rules of engagement said don't attack enemy planes on the ground. You can shoot at them if they're shooting at you in the air, but don't attack them on the ground. Incredible, right? Don't attack truck convoys if they drive 200 yards off the highway. Don't close Haiphong Harbor in North Vietnam, which is the main supply port for the communists, right? Goldwater said these rules unquestionably denied a military victory. Now, I would guess there's a lot of you in the audience that have heard of a fellow named Ken Burns. He puts out television documentaries. He does them on all different kinds of subjects. He even done one on baseball, I think. I haven't seen it. I happened to be at a gathering, nice little reception gathering for some relatives of my neighbors, and it was at their home. And my wife and I were invited to go, and I got chatting with this fellow who came down from New Hampshire. He's a relative of the people who live next door to me. And I said, what town do you live in? He said, well, it's a town nobody had ever heard of. And he mentioned it, and I'd forgotten it. I don't even remember what it was, right? But he said, it's a little bit famous because a fellow named Ken Burns lives there. Oh, I said, Ken Burns, the film producer? He said, yeah, the same guy. I said, do you know Ken Burns? He said, oh, yeah, I see him at the coffee shop a lot downtown. I said, well, what's he up to now? He said, well, he's thinking about doing a series on Vietnam. I said, oh, Vietnam. Do you suppose he has the rules of engagement? The guy said, what's that? So I told him what it was. I said, if I give you a set of the rules of engagement that I have, would you give them to Ken Burns? He says, yeah, no problem. So I hustled over to my own home. I ran it off 17 pages on a copy machine, and I gave it to him. I got a note from him about 10 days later. He said, I met Ken again. I gave him the rules of engagement. He was very grateful. So now he's come out with his Vietnam thing. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's already been on the TV, the first segment. I think there's going to be 10 segments. And I watched the first segment and I turned it off angrily. It's not what I would have hoped. Whether he'll ever get to the rules of engagement, I don't know. But, you know, Birch Society has a way of wangling itself into some of these things. And we don't always get what we want out of it, but we get sometimes. But the rules of engagement are absolutely an abomination, right? Is anybody here that fought in Korea? No? There's one there, one in the back. Okay, now we'll move on. We'll go to the first Iraq War, 1991. And George H.W. Bush, Papa Bush. The Gulf crisis has to do with a new world order. And that world order is only going to be enhanced if this newly activated peacekeeping function of the UN proves to be effective, right? So, was the first Iraq War fought in order to make the UN look good? Yeah. The war stopped suddenly. You may recall that the reason for going was that Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. And here we were now sending hundreds of thousands of troops into the Middle East to protest Saddam Hussein taking over Kuwait. Why we should do that, never been answered. But anyway, we got him out of Kuwait, and all of a sudden the war stopped. And people were saying, well, why didn't they go on to Baghdad and get Saddam Hussein? The Security Council authorized only forcing Iraq out of Kuwait. And it authorized strengthening the United Nations. So that's what that war was fought about, right? The second Iraq War in 2003. This is after the 9/11 tragedy down in New York City and elsewhere. And here's a letter addressed to the Security Council by our ambassador at the time, John Negroponte, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And it says right at the beginning, the actions being taken are authorized by existing Council resolutions, including Resolution 678 and 687, and so on. So we wait till we get authorization from the United Nations before we do anything, right? And then the United Nations controls it, right? Here's a principle, I don't want you to forget this. One seeks authorization from a superior, not an inferior. Who is the superior from whom we seek authorization? The United Nations. Who's the inferior? The United States. All right? Should we get out of the UN?
Yes.
Now we're in Afghanistan. Coming up to the 17th anniversary of our sending troops into Afghanistan. Still sustaining casualties, waiting for the UN's permission to leave the region. The UN will give permission, and we will obey. So I'll summarize UN wars. Korean War, UN flags were flying, UN was in charge. Vietnam War, CEDAW was in charge. That's a UN regional arrangement. Desert Storm, UN authorization. Second Iraq War, UN authorization. Afghanistan War, NATO's in charge. Right? The UN is running our military. Now, an interesting thing happened in October of 2002. you may recall that 9/11 was in 2001. And we didn't go into Iraq the second time until early in 2003. So the members of Congress were debating what to do about this. And Ron Paul stood up, "Mr. Chairman, I have a motion." "What's your motion, Ron?" "I move that we declare war on Iraq, and I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But I also don't think we should ignore the constitutional requirement for a declaration of war." Good for Ron Paul. So what happened? Well, the chairman of the House International Relations Committee, which used to be Foreign Affairs Committee, and again it's Foreign Affairs Committee, but then it was this, Henry Hyde of Chicago. He's the chairman. And he said, "Ron, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. Your measure is inappropriate, anachronistic, it isn't done anymore." In other words, you can declare a portion of the US Constitution inappropriate, anachronistic, and get away with it, which is what Henry Hyde did. Now, he was supposedly a tough hombre, conservative member of the House of Representatives. The term wasn't in use then, but we'd call him a neocon today. There were some of his constituents in the Chicago area where he's from who wrote to him and asked him if the part of the Constitution that says he shall be paid is also anachronistic. And he didn't answer those questions. He didn't answer that. In 1961, the State Department issued a document called 7277. Its full title is Freedom from War, the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. Dean Rusk was the head of the State Department at the time, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. This document called for a gradual turnover of the military to the United Nations. And it also called for disarming the citizenry. It ended up by saying in stage 3, disarmament would proceed to the point where no state or person would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. Right? Now, somebody in Washington sent a copy of that to Robert Welch, the man who was head of the Birch Society, the founder of the Birch Society. And he told an aide, he said, "Get some more copies of this. This is important." So they wrote down to Washington and they got a box full of them. And very quickly, we dispensed those. We got back to Congress, asked for more. "It's out of print." "Oh, it's out of print." Well, it's a US government document, so you didn't have to worry about it. We took it to the local printer, we printed our own. We have printed hundreds of thousands of copies of that document. And we have forestalled its being fully implemented. In 1962, another State Department document was published called "The World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations." It was written by a Council on Foreign Relations member named Lincoln P. Broomfield in MIT, Massachusetts Institute for Technology. It called for total disarmament of civilians. Membership in the new regime, far from being a privilege, would be mandatory. Authored by CFR member Lincoln P. Broomfield. It's about 15 pages long. And you read it and you say, could anybody who claims to be an American really write this kind of stuff? Right? But that hasn't happened either. Now there are gun foes who want civilian disarmament and they go to the United Nations. They have the UN Arms Trade Treaty, which the Birch Society has opposed successfully to date. We hope we can continue. Now down at the lower right hand of this particular slide that you see pictured here, you see a gun with the barrel tied in a knot at the end of it. Very clever, right? It's a gift of the government of Luxembourg to the United Nations. Luxembourg is one of the countries that when Hitler invaded, all he had to do was go down to the city hall or the state capitol and get the lists of people who owned guns. They'd all registered their guns. And he was very able to collect them very quickly. Right? But that is not a military weapon. That is a Colt revolver with the barrel tied in a knot. So who is it aimed at? The military? No. It's aimed at civilians. Right? And that sits in the area right outside the entry of the United Nations headquarters in New York City. That's where it sits. Is the UN anti-gun ownership? Wow, are they ever? Here's an article from our New American Magazine. If you don't get it, I hope you will get it. Start to get it. Headline in it, Gun Control Mrs. Mark. Senator Feinstein shoots off mouth, hits foot. Yep, right. Now the UN is forbidden by its own charter to intervene domestically in any nation. Right? What it says, I quoted here on Article 2, Paragraph 7, nothing in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the jurisdiction of any state. Well, does the United Nations meddle? All the time. Right? Here's a United Nations organizational chart. I know you can't read it. What I have in front of me, I can't read it either, but I have read it. What does it do? It lists all of the different divisions of the United Nations. Right? You can see how many there are, right? So UN tentacles are active in education, population, children, women, environment, trade, finance, health, agriculture, labor, military, science, culture, atomic power, telecommunications, aviation, industrial development, narcotics, refugees, property rights, and more. And that's what all those people in those buildings are doing. Right? The UN has a refugee agency, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR. It designates who is and who is not a refugee. It proposes which country must accept them. In 2016, President Obama agreed to accept 85,000 designated by the United Nations. It didn't happen. Right? In 2017, plans are laid for the U.S. to accept 100,000. Again, it didn't happen. Right? Right? So some of the things the UN wants done aren't happening. Thank goodness, right? But how about intervening in domestic matters? Does the UN do that? Well, in Katanga in 1961, they shot up the hospital, they killed a lot of civilians, and they destroyed the independence movement of a noble African named Moïse Chambé, who wanted to take his portion of the former Belgian Congo away from a communist government that had seized control under a man named Patrice Lumumba. Rhodesia, destruction of a nation. Yeah, it's been destroyed. It became Zimbabwe, and it's a classic example of what inflation can do to a country. Australia, they stopped a hydroelectric power plant, did the UN. In Guatemala, they changed the constitution to promote abortion. The constitution in Costa Rica said no abortion. The European Union has destroyed the sovereignties of 27 member states. Thank goodness Britain pulled out. I hope they stay out. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are meddling in all kinds of things within the domestic jurisdiction of nation after nation after nation. How about in the United States? Well, the United Nations has spoken out about our laws against abortion. Right? We don't have the proper law against abortion, that it should all be stopped. but we have some law, and the United Nations doesn't even want that. They stopped a mining project up in Montana. They have spoken out against our laws allowing capital punishment. They don't like our border control, and I don't like it either. I think it should be tougher, right?
Yeah.
They have passed judicial decisions to regulate affairs within the United States, and they're constantly working to destroy the right to be armed, right? So they violate their own charter. The UN Charter for them is, well, we'll use this part of it because it helps us, and if this part of it doesn't work, we'll just ignore it. Right? Intervening in the United States, this is an interesting quote from a California Supreme Court judge, Frank Newman. He says, someday it will be malpractice for lawyers to fail to include UN human rights law in their cases. Right? I can see that coming. I hope it never does, but it's possible. What's the cost to of the UN to the United States? Well, partial US cost in 2010 was added up to $7.7 billion. But you know, $7.7 billion, fine. I would donate that to someplace if we could get out of the United Nations. There's massive intervening under Agenda 21. I would hope you've heard of Agenda 21, and the 21 is not that there's an Agenda 19 and a 20 and an 18 and a 16, no. It's to be implemented in the year the beginning of the 21st century. Now, in its own foreword, written by a Agenda 21 pro-UN lawyer, he says, Agenda 21 proposes an array of actions which are intended to be implemented by every person on earth. Effective execution will require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. Right? Agenda 21. Now, they have speeded up their proposal now. They've come out with a new one called Agenda 2030. They want to have all this done by the year 2030, which is essentially right around the corner. It's a stealth operation. They don't tell you when they start doing this and this and this and this. That is part of Agenda 21. But it operates in property rights and family size and water rights and civil liberties and waste disposal. They have mandates about food and transportation, energy, education, children. Right? As the guy said, profound reorientation of all human society. Right? So we've done what we could to stop Agenda 21. It's globalism for your children. This is about Common Core, which came out of the UN. Right? Common Core and UNESCO. Arnie Duncan was the Secretary of Education. He's not anymore. Now we've got the Betsy DeVos. She's doing some good things. I hope she's able to keep up. But Arnie Duncan said, our goal for the coming year will be to work closely with global partners, including UNESCO, to promote qualitative improvement and system strengthening. Yeah, you bet your life. So we've got new 3 R's. It used to be reading, writing, and arithmetic. And now it's recycling, racism, and reproduction, right? From Agenda 21 to Agenda 2030. Call for domination of the planet. Speed up the attainment of the goal. The European Union originally was only a trade agreement. It became the European Economic Community, later named the European Union. It grew to 25 nations. Now it's 28 nations minus 1, Britain. Now it's 27 nations again. But the European Union put out a draft constitution that they wanted all the countries to sign. This was about 6 or 8 years ago. And I remember reading that draft constitution and writing about it. They sent it to the different states, the different countries in the European community for ratification. And the French and Dutch people rejected it in referenda that they had. So then what happened is they substituted a treaty, and this time they didn't offer it to the people to judge. They sent it to the leaders of the 28 nations, and they all signed it. And it's full of the United Nations. I've read through it. United Nations this, United Nations that. Now here's a little religious concept I want to pass along. On the left here you see a painting of a French, Flemish individual named Bruegel. And he put out his painting to depict what he thought the Tower of Babel might have looked like. I think many of you know the story of the Tower of Babel, where they were building up something to reach up and challenge God. Right? So didn't the UN come out with, didn't the European Union come out with their own poster depicting first the 16th century painting, and secondly, the modern adaptation of that, rebuilding the Tower of Babel. What happened at Babel? People trying to reach up to God and challenge God. So what did God do? He confused the tongues, didn't he? And the people who could speak to each other went off and formed a nation here. Other people could speak to each other, went off and formed a nation here. And others over here and here. The beginning of nationhood occurred at Babel. Nationhood is good. World government is bad. It's in the scripture. It's right there in your Bible. Now, notice on the right there, you see the crane, you see the workman, and you see funny looking stars. They're not stars. They're pentagrams. That's a satanic symbol. That poster says all kinds of things. And the UN is behind all of it. The UN runs the European Union just like it runs the United States military. Now these Trans-Pacific Partnership that's been proposed, 5,500 pages, establishes a commission like the European Union, a legislative body superior to Congress. Chapter 20 is all about environmentalism. President Obama agreed to it. Congress will vote yes or no, and it looks like we're going to win that battle. It looks like it's not going to get approved. Right? And the Birch Society, again. The Trans-Pacific Partnership will enforce climate treaty, have tribunals to supersede U.S. law, increase legal immigration, reduce patent protection, place quotas on U.S. agricultural exports. It's a duplicate of the European Union and a huge step into control of our country by the UN, but it hasn't been ratified. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees. People apply to him for the status of refugee, and then he decides what country to send them to. And the welfare for the new refugees is supplied by you and me, our taxes. President Obama wanted 100,000 new refugees. Well, thank goodness he's not in the White House anymore. Former Director James Comey of the FBI, and I got problems with James Comey. I think a lot of you might have problems with James Comey. But he said this while he was still head of the FBI. They were asking him if he was able, the FBI, to check all the people who were coming in as refugees. Right? They use the term vet. Right? So Comey said if someone has never made a ripple in the pond in Syria in a way that would get their identity or their interest reflected in our database, we can query our database until the cows come home, but there will be nothing show up because we have no record. Right? And that's still the same case. There are tens of thousands of people who want to come to the United States. I have my problems with Mr. Trump, but it's not about this. There's a duplicate, the Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. Real goal, have the U.S. join the European Union and come even more deeply under the UN, provide bailout funds. Right? I give a talk on the economic situation, the heavy indebtedness that we have and so forth. And I point out that one of the things the Federal Reserve does secretly that we would like to see made open, have an audit of the Federal Reserve. You may recall it was, I don't know, a year or more ago that Greece was in terrible financial shape, right? And the people couldn't even get their money out of the bank, right? Who bailed them out? The Federal Reserve bailed them out. We bailed out Greece. God bless us. Right. Now, to give you an idea of the United Nations and UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and something organization, cultural organization. Here's Jacques Cousteau, right? That friendly little Frenchman riding around the water in his Calypso boat. Everybody, oh, isn't he wonderful, or something like that. The man is a savage. He actually wrote what I've got here in the United Nations Courier, UNESCO Courier in Paris. It's terrible I have to say this. World population must be stabilized, and to do that we must eliminate 350,000 people per day to get from 7 billion people down to 1 billion people, right? Which is what they're aiming for. And the UN published that. The UN made a hero out of Jacques Cousteau. So the key is to get us out. Withdraw the United States from the United Nations and you have broken the back of the world conspiracy, said Robert Welch, the founder of the Birch Society. Is it a conspiracy? Well, the first job of conspiracy is to convince the world there's no conspiracy. That's the first job. Right? Now you go to somebody and you tell them maybe tomorrow or within the next week, you went and you heard this speech about the United Nations and so on, and you mention a fact here or a fact there. You're going to be told by some people you sound like a conspiracy theorist, right? Right? You're not. You're not a conspiracy theorist. You're a conspiracy factist. Right? Yep. Right. And don't let anybody stop you from telling the truth. Conspiracy surely does exist. Here's Robert Welch again. There's a conspiracy at work as sure as there is a law of gravity. Well, that's a pretty good summation. So, America's leaders, they're not stupid bunglers. They're not lacking information. Ergo, conspiracy. So let's make some conclusions. The United Nations is not taking over the United States. Instead, the United States is being delivered to the United Nations by our own leaders. That's a big distinction. If I just left the first half of that, you'd wonder if I had lost my mind. No, I haven't. I need to have people understand the second part of this. Conclusion number 2. Membership in the UN is completely incompatible with an independent US and freedom for the American people. Okay? All right, so what should be done? Should the UN be reformed? If you have cancer, do you reform it? Should the U.S. reduce payments? Only down to nothing. Only down to nothing. Should the UN have a new Secretary General? Well, they have a new Secretary General. It's a man named Guterres, and he's from Portugal, where he has served as the head of the Communist Party in Portugal for a long, long time. So what should be done? The only sensible solution. Get us out of the United Nations. Now that's a billboard, I don't know that it's still up, but it was in Arizona. And if you go from Tucson to Phoenix, you pass by I happened to be there not too many years ago, and I told the guy who was driving me, I said, well, when you get to the billboard, I said, please stop, I want to get out and genuflect. He did. So, House Resolution 1205, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, written by that young lady I told you was working for Ron Paul. A measure to provide for complete withdrawal of the United States from the United Nations. Introduced by Mike Rogers of Alabama. Here are some of the co-sponsors. There are more now. The John Birch Society. What are we all about? Rock solid information? Yeah. 5 decades of experience, make that 6. Sorely needed national organization? Yeah. A plan for victory? Yeah. Just imagine, if you will, a group of 10, 12, 20 people in cities and towns all across the United States, spreading good information, having people come and see a DVD of a talk about the United Nations. Just imagine. Do you think politicians would begin to understand that they better get with it? That's our goal. That's our goal. So you folks who are here tonight, many of you are already members of the society, I'm sure. You know what I'm talking about. You're a small group of people within a large population, but history is made by the dedicated few. Always has been. Let's continue to make it. More and more and more, right? And continue to get more people to do it, right? The JBS plan, very simple. Inform ourselves and others, understand the enemy. Educate and activate friends, grow membership, train leaders, change the voting record, or change the congressman. Right? Restore constitutional government, maintain vigilance. Okay? That's pretty simple, but it's not easily accomplished. I know that. It takes a lot of hard work. We have a 50-page booklet called The United Nations Exposed. It's something written by himself, here the Irish would say, by himself. Right? How we got in 1945, why we should withdraw. Right? Copies are available on the book table, among other things. Right? So the commonly held attitudes are wrong. It's not just a forum for blowing off steam, bloviating. It's not something that never accomplished anything. It's not something that needs better leaders or a place to talk rather than fight. So the choice is ours. Less government or world government. U.S. Constitution or UN Charter. God or no God. Those are our choices. A better world or a new world order. That's what we're up against, right? To achieve victory, we need more members of the John Birch Society. So I invite all of you who are not members, join up tonight. We need you, you need us. And you'll be very glad you did. And with all that said, Robert Welsh always closed his meetings with, come join us in our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking. And that's my attitude as well. And I thank you very much for your close attention. Thank you.